world just changed in the early 90s, completely and utterly. I mean, prior to that, the skills that you needed as a journalist were fundamentally driven by a technology that was invented hundreds of years earlier. And the fundamental model of journalism, print journalism, hadn't changed. And for people in Fairfax Media, there were rules and ways of doing things that hadn't changed for a long time. Internet comes along, and I remember Philip Knightley saying that for the first time in human history, the supply of information outweighed the demand for information. It was a transformational time. And so therefore, given this new technology came along and meant that information was easier to get, could be disseminated much more widely, that we could drill down in terms of levels of detail that we couldn't drill down into before, journalists had to learn to live in a completely new world. And that's just built and built and built and built and built in the last 20 years. So when I started in the 70s, it was literally, typewriters on the table, fixed line telephones, everybody around you smoking, half the day, maybe that's an exaggeration, down the pub. You didn't have any concern about the money coming in because there was monopolies around the classified businesses, jobs, homes, cars. So it was a different life. What the internet did was change the way, as I said, information was disseminated, but also changed the business model. It fragmented that advertising market. And so there wasn't as much money coming into the industry. We had to change as journalists about the way we work. We had to work across every technology that was available that the internet had created. So what's that mean? You have to innovate. You have to understand that innovation empowers your ability to not just work but to connect with your audience, and that's got to be really at the heart of the way you work in the future.
The industry's been in crisis for quite a number of years. I mean, it's not as though this has been a surprise to journalists in Australia. We just had to look at what was happening to the industry in America, what was happening in England as well in terms of the falling revenues where classifieds were going to, famous online outfits like Craigslist in San Francisco and the way that fundamentally changed the nature of the business. Plus the changing readership where people are going to get their news, not just print, radio, TV, but so much of online, to know that we at some point or other we're going to have to change.
Why do we need to innovate? We need to innovate because the world is changing around us, and you need to. It's probably impossible to ever predict what it's going to do. The examples I always use, anyone who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen in the world of digital media or media in general is probably lying, because I always like to cite the example of MySpace. MySpace was destroyed when Facebook came along. But even in the travel world, I say to people in the travel industry, had you heard of TripAdvisor 5 years ago? Okay, maybe you'd heard of it 5 years ago. Had you heard of it 10 years ago? Because it's been around for 10 years. No one had heard of it 10 years ago. It's now the biggest travel site in the world. So things are changing all the time, and you need to try and find new ways to engage with readers. And if you don't do that, readers are going to abandon you because they are constantly finding new ways to interact with each other.
Our competition now comes from many areas, not just from other established media organisations in Australia, such as the ABC and 9MSN, but new groups are developing in Australia, such as Mail Online and BuzzFeed, and they have a very different approach to journalism, and we need to compete with these media outlets also.
There's stories there about a computer terminal having a glass box over it with a lock, and you had to have a key to get in there because everyone was scared about what the internet would do. And when we finally embraced it, and at Fairfax we were fairly early on, luckily and fortunately we had some really visionary people who said, we reckon this might take off. Yeah, it might kick on a little bit. We got in early. And so we've had to learn to innovate, particularly over the last decade when we've seen this enormous fragmentation of our audiences. This is unprecedented. There has never been anything like it, except probably when the printing press was first invented. The Gutenberg printing press was invented 500 years ago. We've seen a fracturing, and no one ever saw this coming at this speed and at this magnitude. And so now it's imperative that we all innovate, and depending on what you call and define innovation. But I just think it's all about getting back to the roots of journalism, being fast, being agile, being quick off the mark, and telling stories in creative and inventive ways and not being stale. So to me, innovation is all about creating a culture where people don't think about, oh, well, we've got to cover the World Cup soccer this year. How did we cover it 4 years ago? Let's just do the same thing, which is what we have done in journalism for a long, long time.
If you look back to the early 2000s where we had the sort of sharp drop-offs in consumption of news, and we saw people moving to alternate news sites like blogs and various other services, there's an argument that could be made that newspapers lost audience there because they didn't adapt to that changing in behaviour. And as we've seen newspapers take on those new online storytelling techniques and adopt those practices, we've seen them come back, and we've seen that sort of return to quality that you expect from mastheads. We've seen paywalls gaining traction, but it's because journalists have moved to innovate in the online and to take on those new practices.
Basically, keeping up is being left behind. If you're not thinking about a new way of doing something, then you're really just not doing enough. If you're just trying to copy and ape what others are doing, and that's not good enough either. And audiences are so savvy and so smart, and they know when you're just doing something for the sake of it, and you're actually not really engaged. Engagement as well is so important, and really listening to what your audience wants and is doing. And so rather than just waiting and seeing what happens, we need to be really trying to be at the forefront of where things are heading.
I don't know if I can tell you exactly what mindset people need to be in to innovate. What I could say is that it takes a special kind of person. There are people who will always be able to tell a fantastic story. They'll be able to get people to tell them the fantastic story in the first place and then report it. It's those people that are constantly looking for new ways to tell that story, and those value add-ons that they're giving the audience that are so valuable to us as an industry. We can't survive without innovation. We know we need to. It's a much smaller industry. We need to offer more with less. It's in the person you target. Is it a mindset? I think it's more than that. I think it's probably in someone's DNA. I've employed people that are extremely innovative. I've employed people that aren't. I know the ones in those two camps that I need to keep.